I never imagined that the family I grew up with could betray me in the quietest way imaginable, leaving me blindsided and heartbroken. My parents, the people I trusted most, handed my inheritance straight to my older brother, as if I had never existed in their plans. Little did they know the one secret Grandpa had kept hidden for decades. His old safe, tucked away behind a false panel in his study, was about to turn everything upside down. My name is Claire Bennett, and this is the story of how what was meant to be lost forever ended up restoring not only what was taken from me, but a sense of justice I didn't even know I craved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I grew up in a modest suburban neighborhood in Mapleton, Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and the neighborhood gossip spreads faster than the morning paper. Our house was a 2-story brick home with a small garden out front where Grandpa would spend hours tending to his roses and humming old jazz tunes. As a child, I always adored him. He was a quiet man, gruff only when necessary, but underneath that stern exterior was a heart full of stories, wisdom, and, apparently, secrets. My brother Ethan was always the golden child in my parents' eyes. He had the charm, the smarts, the athleticism, and frankly, the confidence that seemed to open doors wherever he went. Meanwhile, I had learned to stay in the shadows, excel quietly, and avoid causing any ripples. I thought I was okay with that. I thought it was just the way our family worked. But I didn't realize how deep the imbalance ran until that fateful day. The day my parents called me into the living room felt like any other. They were sipping their afternoon coffee, newspapers folded neatly on the side table, and there was a heaviness in the air I couldn't place. My father, a stoic man named Richard, rarely showed emotion, while my mother, Marlene, wore a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. When they finally spoke, it was in the softest, most deliberate tones, as if every word had been measured and rehearsed. "Claire, we need to talk about the inheritance." My stomach twisted, though I had expected this moment would eventually come. Grandpa had passed away nearly a year prior, and though I had been heartbroken, I had also assumed that Grandpa's will would be fair. He had always treated Ethan and me equally, or so I thought. What followed felt like a slow-motion betrayal. They told me, with a mixture of awkward hesitancy and false justification, that everything had been left to Ethan. He needs it more. He's building a family, starting his own business. And you're doing fine on your own. I stared at them, trying to comprehend the words that sounded like daggers. Fine on my own? My life hadn't been easy, but I had worked tirelessly to support myself through college, struggled to pay off my student loans, and carved a career from scratch. Yet somehow in their eyes that didn't matter. It was a punch to the gut, a silent confirmation that I had never truly been the daughter they had imagined. Ethan, for his part, looked uncomfortable, shuffling his feet and avoiding eye contact, but he didn't protest. I realized then that he hadn't asked for this. He was merely the vessel of my parents' favoritism. I left the living room that day feeling hollow and invisible, retreating to my small apartment downtown where the city noise mingled with my swirling thoughts. I replayed the scene over and over, trying to pinpoint the exact moment I should have spoken up or done something differently. But the truth was, I had no idea. The injustice felt absolute, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I became, not at Ethan, but at the quiet complacency of everyone around me. I had grown up believing that family meant loyalty, protection, and fairness. That belief had been shattered in a matter of minutes. It was late one night while scrolling through old family photos in a dusty photo album I had kept from my childhood that I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. In a picture taken in Grandpa's study, partially obscured by the angle of the shot, there was a faint outline in the wall behind his desk, a panel that didn't quite match the rest of the woodwork. I remember staring at it, heart skipping a beat because a memory surfaced. Grandpa had once joked about a treasure hidden in plain sight when I asked about how he kept his private things safe. I had laughed at the time, assuming it was just another one of his whimsical remarks. But now, in the wake of my parents' betrayal, the joke felt like a clue, a lifeline thrown to me from beyond the grave. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to that memory again and again, convinced that Grandpa hadn't left everything vulnerable to my parents' whims. I scoured the corners of his old study when I could, dusting off shelves, examining every crevice, every bookcase, and every inch of wall. The panel from the photo beckoned it to me, a subtle anomaly that begged for closer inspection. I didn't know what I expected to find, a few old letters, perhaps, or some trinkets, but something deep inside me whispered that the true inheritance had never been about money alone. Grandpa had always been practical, cautious, and clever. He didn't trust the world to do the right thing, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had left me a path to reclaim what was mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with possibilities, the sting of betrayal still fresh, but now mingled with a spark of curiosity and hope. If Grandpa's safe was still there, hidden behind that panel, it meant that my story wasn't over yet. It meant that the injustice could be corrected, that I might have a chance to reclaim not only what was legally mine, but also my sense of self-worth. Little did I know, the journey to uncover that hidden safe would test every ounce of my patience, courage, and ingenuity. It would force me to confront family secrets, long-buried resentments, and a shocking truth that would change my life forever. And so, with a mixture of trepidation and determination, I resolved to start my search. I didn't know what I would find, or if the discovery would even be what I hoped for, but I knew one thing for certain. This was my moment to step out of the shadows and claim my rightful place, no longer overlooked, no longer dismissed. The story of Grandpa's hidden safe and what lay inside was about to unfold, and it would reveal a truth that no one in my family could ignore. The days that followed my parents' announcement were some of the hardest I had ever faced, and not just because of the financial blow. It was the quiet, invisible weight of being dismissed, of realizing that my own family, my parents, who were supposed to guide and protect me, had made a decision that treated me as if I didn't matter. I tried to keep busy, throwing myself into work and long walks through Mapleton's tree-lined streets, but even the bustling city couldn't drown out the gnawing sense of injustice. At the office, colleagues noticed my distracted state, offering concerned smiles, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. There was no easy way to say, my own family erased me from my inheritance, and I'm not sure how to fight back. I felt trapped in a mix of anger, shame, and helplessness, and the isolation was suffocating. Every night I returned to that memory of Grandpa's study, the faint outline of the hidden panel lingering in my mind. It had become an obsession, not because of the money alone, though that was tempting enough, but because it represented a small fragment of fairness, a chance to reclaim something that had been unfairly taken from me. I started researching how old safes were typically hidden in homes built in the 1960s, digging through online forums and old locksmith manuals. Grandpa's house, though modest, had been sturdy and meticulously constructed. He had been a man who valued discretion, and it was clear he wouldn't have left something like his savings or important documents in a simple drawer or obvious location. I began to imagine the safe behind that false panel, and with each mental sketch, I became more convinced that there was something tangible waiting for me, something my parents had overlooked. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Meanwhile, Ethan seemed to glide through life as if nothing had happened. He thanked our parents politely, reassured them he would be responsible with the inheritance, and went about his business building his trendy coffee shop chain he had been dreaming about for years. I tried to tell myself not to compare our lives, not to let jealousy or resentment consume me, but it was impossible. Seeing him bask in the approval I had never received from my parents deepened the sting, reminding me that I had been written off long ago. Every text from Ethan about his new equipment or his latest business plan felt like a quiet taunt, even though he likely had no idea of the storm brewing inside me. I wanted to scream, to demand recognition, to remind my parents that their favoritism had consequences. But more than that, I wanted proof that I hadn't been forgotten, that Grandpa's wisdom and foresight had given me a secret advantage they could never take away. During this period, I also discovered how little my parents had truly thought about fairness. Marlene, my mother, seemed almost relieved to have resolved what she called family matters, while Richard, my father, barely acknowledged my presence except in passing. Family dinners, once a comforting routine, became tense and awkward, each conversation laden with unspoken judgment. I realized that my parents had grown so accustomed to favoring Ethan that it never occurred to them to include me in discussions about money or family planning. It was as if my contributions, my sacrifices, and my loyalty had never been part of the equation. It was during one of my evening walks that I decided to take action. I could no longer sit idle, letting resentment fester without direction. I remembered Grandpa's meticulous nature, how he always kept ledgers, notes, and reminders for himself, often with tiny symbols or codes only he understood. It occurred to me that finding the hidden safe might not just be about luck or intuition. It could involve interpreting clues he had intentionally left behind. I started digging through old letters I had saved, photographs, and even his personal journals. Each item contained small, almost cryptic notes, arrows drawn in margins, faint pencil markings near numbers, and comments like, "Trust the wall, but not the obvious." The more I studied them, the more a picture formed in my mind, and the more I realized that Grandpa had deliberately designed a puzzle only someone who truly cared and paid attention could solve. It was as if he had left me a private inheritance test, one that required patience, persistence, and courage. Despite the quiet thrill of discovery, there were moments of despair. I doubted myself constantly. What if I imagined the panel? What if I was chasing a phantom, and my parents were right to dismiss me? There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if my desire for this hidden inheritance was petty or misguided. But something in me refused to let the thought go. Grandpa had been my hero, the one adult who had consistently treated me as his equal. If he had gone to the trouble of hiding a safe, it was because he wanted me to find it, to prove my worthiness, to teach me a lesson in patience and diligence. That belief became my anchor. I also began to notice the subtle cracks in my parents' armor. Richard, though outwardly composed, had grown increasingly forgetful about details at the house, misplacing small items or forgetting conversations. And Marlene had started to make casual comments about the importance of family, almost as if trying to reassure herself that she had done the right thing. These small vulnerabilities gave me hope. If I could find the safe, I might have leverage, not to punish them, but to reveal the truth, to balance the scales of justice that had been tipped so unfairly. By the end of that week, I had formulated a plan. I would return to Grandpa's house, under the guise of organizing some old belongings, and examine every inch of the study for the hidden panel. I armed myself with tools, patience, and a notebook to track every clue. The stakes felt high, not just financially, but emotionally. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine. It was about proving to myself that I had the courage and determination to confront injustice even when it came from those I loved most. As I prepared for my first serious search, I couldn't shake the feeling that the discovery would change everything, not only my inheritance, but my place in the family and my understanding of who I truly was. The morning I decided to take action, the air in Mapleton felt heavier than usual, as if the universe itself was pressing on my chest to remind me of the stakes. I remember standing outside Grandpa's old brick house, keys in hand, staring at the familiar front door that had once swung open to welcome me with warmth and laughter. The neighborhood seemed unchanged, the same quiet streets, the same old maple trees lining the sidewalks, but to me, nothing felt the same. I had changed. My parents' betrayal had carved a hollow in my chest, and the thought of Grandpa's hidden safe offered a glimmer of hope, a way to reclaim both dignity and something tangible that was rightfully mine. I had prepared meticulously, notebook in my bag, flashlight, measuring tape, and a small toolkit I'd borrowed from a local hardware store. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew I had to try. The house smelled the same as it had when Grandpa was alive, a mixture of old wood, faint lavender from his hand lotion, and the lingering scent of polished brass. I moved quietly through the rooms, careful not to disturb anything, knowing that my parents' presence might be felt even in their absence. The living room was exactly as I remembered. Comfortable armchairs, books stacked on end tables, and photographs of family events frozen in time. My fingers brushed over the edges of frames, the spines of books, and the polished surfaces, tracing memories while simultaneously scanning for clues. I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and urgency. Each familiar object was a reminder of the person who had believed in me when no one else did. Eventually, I made my way to Grandpa's study, the heart of the house where so many of our conversations had taken place. The desk was imposing, dark wood polished to a soft sheen, and I paused for a moment, just taking it in. Grandpa had spent hours here, writing letters, balancing accounts, and occasionally sharing stories that made me feel smart and capable in ways my parents never had. My eyes fell on the wall behind the desk, and for the first time I noticed the subtle imperfection I had seen in the old photograph, a faint rectangle slightly lighter than the surrounding wood, as if someone had patched it over. My pulse quickened. This was it. The panel was real. I knelt on the floor, flashlight in hand, and examined the edges carefully. There was a tiny groove along one side, almost invisible, where a finger could slip to release a hidden latch. I traced the edges repeatedly, pressing gently, hoping for some mechanism to give way. Minutes felt like hours. My hands shook from adrenaline in anticipation, but I forced myself to stay calm. Grandpa's notes had hinted at this. Trust the wall, but not the obvious. I thought about what that meant. Perhaps it required not just touch, but the right combination of pressure and movement. I leaned closer, listening for any click or shift. Suddenly, a soft pop echoed from the wall, and the panel shifted outward slightly. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed the edge and carefully pulled it open, revealing a small steel safe embedded within the wall. It was old but solid, with a combination dial that gleamed faintly under my flashlight. I pressed my hand against it, feeling the cool metal, and my thoughts raced. I hadn't expected the moment to feel so real, so heavy with consequence. This was the tangible proof that Grandpa had never forgotten me, that he had anticipated a day when I would need to reclaim what was mine. It wasn't just money, it was validation, a message that I was seen, that my intelligence and persistence mattered. I set my toolkit down and examined the dial. Grandpa had been meticulous, and I knew the combination would not be obvious. I took a deep breath, remembering the cryptic notes he had left behind, numbers scribbled in margins, faint calculations in his old journals, and even subtle references in photographs that had initially seemed meaningless. I spent hours cross-referencing everything, methodically testing possibilities. The safe became an enigma I was determined to solve, and with each failed attempt, my resolve only grew. I wasn't just doing this for the inheritance anymore. I was doing it to prove to myself that I had the right to fight, to insist on justice, and to honor Grandpa's cleverness. Even as I worked, I felt the weight of the outside world pressing in. If my parents discovered what I was doing, it could lead to confrontation, arguments, and more heartbreak. Ethan, too, would likely be upset, though I hoped he would understand that this wasn't about competition. It was about fairness and uncovering a truth that had been hidden from me. The thought of their potential reactions only steeled my determination. This was my test, my journey, and I had to see it through on my own terms. By late afternoon, my fingers were sore and my mind was exhausted from calculations and trial and error attempts at the combination. But then, almost as if Grandpa were guiding my hand, the dial clicked into place. I turned it one final time, and the safe door creaked open, revealing its contents. My breath caught in my throat. Inside were stacks of documents, envelopes marked with careful handwriting, and a small box that shimmered in the fading light. It wasn't just money, though there was a significant sum. It was evidence of Grandpa's foresight. Deeds, bonds, and a detailed record of assets he had kept entirely separate from my parents' knowledge. The realization hit me. Grandpa had deliberately ensured that I, not my parents or anyone else, would be the one to inherit these treasures if I was willing to find them. As I held the papers in my hands, I felt a mixture of awe, relief, and vindication. Grandpa had never forgotten me. He had given me a chance to prove myself, to take control of my life, and to reclaim what was rightfully mine. But alongside that triumph came the weight of responsibility. How would I confront my parents? How would I handle Ethan? The journey was far from over. The safe had been found, but now the real challenge awaited: exposing the hidden truth without destroying the fragile bonds of family, and ensuring that justice, not revenge, guided my next steps. The moment the safe swung open in my hands, I realized that nothing about my life would remain the same. I had stumbled onto something my parents had completely overlooked, a secret Grandpa had safeguarded with precision, and the weight of its existence pressed down on me with both exhilaration and dread. I knew the next step couldn't be done alone. I needed someone objective, someone who could validate the legitimacy of the documents and help me understand the full scope of what I had uncovered. After much deliberation, I decided to contact Rachel Linton, a family attorney Grandpa had once consulted. Rachel had a reputation for discretion and thoroughness, and I hoped she would treat the matter with the seriousness it deserved, without letting my parents get the wind of the discovery too soon. The next morning, I drove across town to Rachel's office, clutching the small box and a stack of documents, as if they were fragile relics. I tried to appear casual, but my hands betrayed me with subtle trembling. The receptionist led me into a private office, and within minutes, Rachel appeared, tall, composed, and sharp-eyed, a woman in her early 50s, whose presence demanded attention. I explained my situation, my voice tight with urgency, emphasizing that these documents had been hidden by my late grandfather and that my parents were unaware. Rachel listened intently, flipping through the papers and examining the handwriting, the official seals, and the detailed records of assets Grandpa had accumulated over decades. She nodded slowly, her expression betraying a mix of respect and surprise. "Claire," she said finally, "your grandfather was meticulous. He clearly intended these to reach you, and you've uncovered what he wanted protected. This is indisputable."
Hearing those words felt like a vindication I hadn't anticipated. Up until that point, the sting of being overlooked by my parents had been a persistent ache, a reminder that family loyalty had limits when filtered through favoritism. But Rachel's confirmation made it clear. Grandpa had intentionally left me a path to reclaim my inheritance, one that couldn't be ignored or denied. I felt a surge of empowerment, but it was tempered by the realization that the next stage would be more complicated. My parents couldn't remain oblivious forever, and confronting them required a careful strategy. If I moved too hastily, I risked creating irreparable tension. If I waited too long, they might try to reclaim control. I needed precision, patience, and the right moment. When I returned home, I spent hours poring over the documents, organizing them into categories: properties, savings, personal items, and business holdings. Grandpa had clearly left meticulous instructions for their management, specifying conditions and beneficiaries with the kind of clarity that left little room for dispute. The more I read, the more I realized that Grandpa had not only ensured I would inherit what was rightfully mine, but had also planned for a way to expose the favoritism of my parents without making it messy or public. It was as if he had anticipated every obstacle, every hesitation, and every potential betrayal. The realization filled me with a strange mixture of awe and responsibility. I was now the custodian of his foresight, and with it came the obligation to act wisely. The very next day, I returned to the house under the guise of picking up old family items for storage. I needed to observe my parents' reactions to my sudden involvement with Grandpa's possessions without revealing that I had already found the safe. Marlene greeted me warmly, her tone almost suspiciously sweet. "It's nice to see you taking an interest in Grandpa's things," she said, glancing at the boxes I carried. Richard remained quiet, his eyes briefly meeting mine before darting away, a subtle flicker of discomfort passing across his usually stoic face. Even Ethan seemed a little uneasy, though he tried to mask it with casual chatter about his startup. I couldn't tell if they sensed anything, but the seed of suspicion was planted, and I felt the first taste of leverage. That evening, while organizing old papers in the attic, I noticed subtle signs that my parents had been careless in managing Grandpa's estate. There were stacks of unopened letters, receipts left in disarray, and even financial documents that seemed misplaced or incomplete. It was clear that neither Marlene nor Richard had bothered to verify the details before granting Ethan full access to the inheritance. My heart ached with a mix of frustration and grim satisfaction. The injustice had been compounded by their negligence, and now I had an undeniable advantage. I wasn't merely reclaiming what was mine, I was uncovering proof that my parents had acted impulsively, without the diligence that Grandpa himself would have demanded. By the end of the week, I'd enlisted Rachel to conduct a preliminary review of the assets and validate everything for legal purposes. She assured me that once formalized, the documentation would make it impossible for my parents to dispute my claim. That knowledge was empowering, but it also brought a new set of anxieties. How would they react when confronted? Would Ethan side with them out of familial loyalty, or would he recognize the truth? And most importantly, could I maintain the moral high ground, ensuring that my actions were about justice rather than revenge? These questions haunted me, but I knew that I couldn't wait any longer. Grandpa had entrusted me with this task, and I owed it to him and to myself to see it through. Late one night, as I sat in my apartment surrounded by Grandpa's documents and notes, the enormity of what I had uncovered settled over me like a tangible weight. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a revelation, a hidden truth that challenged the very dynamics of my family. For the first time, I saw the contours of a larger story unfolding, one that involved not only financial justice, but also moral reckoning. My parents had overlooked the possibility that I could uncover the safe. They had underestimated my resolve and my connection to Grandpa, and now, armed with undeniable evidence, I realized that the hidden truth was no longer confined to secret walls or cryptic notes. It was about to surface, and everyone involved would have to confront it. After confirming the legitimacy of Grandpa's hidden safe and its contents with Rachel, I realized that uncovering the evidence was only the first step in a much larger, more emotionally charged journey. The true challenge lay in navigating the web of family dynamics that had been quietly poisoned over the years, a delicate balance of confrontation, patience, and strategy. Each day brought with it an increasing internal struggle, a tug of war between the desire to act swiftly and the need to proceed methodically. I understood now that this wasn't merely about reclaiming what was legally mine. It was about standing up to the subtle injustices I had endured my whole life and asserting my presence in a family that had long dismissed me. Ethan, despite his outward composure, began to exhibit subtle signs of suspicion. During a family dinner one evening, I noticed the way he avoided my gaze, fingers fidgeting under the table as he tried to steer conversation toward neutral topics. I caught him glancing toward the attic door, where the safe was hidden in Grandpa's study, and my stomach tightened. I knew then that he might already be questioning what I had discovered, even if he hadn't confronted me directly. The knowledge that someone in the family might be watching, analyzing, and perhaps even trying to gain an advantage created a quiet tension in the house. I found myself second-guessing each word I spoke, each interaction, afraid that even a small misstep could alert my parents before I was ready. I spent long hours each night poring over Grandpa's notes,
attempting to piece together a strategy that would maximize both fairness and impact. The documents revealed not only financial assets, but also detailed instructions about how they should be distributed, under what circumstances, and even subtle notes about family responsibilities and expectations. It became clear that Grandpa had anticipated potential disputes, leaving explicit instructions to protect the inheritance from hasty or biased decisions. This gave me confidence, but also weighed heavily on me. I knew that following his guidance would require confronting my parents in a way that could not be ignored, a confrontation that might fracture relationships that had already been strained. Meanwhile, my parents began to show cracks in their armor, subtle signs that the first seeds of doubt had begun to grow. Marlene would occasionally make passing comments about Grandpa's meticulous nature and his tendency to leave things in unexpected places, while Richard's stoic demeanor seemed punctuated by moments of uncharacteristic hesitation, as if he were reconsidering his previous decisions. I realized that while they might still believe they had acted in Ethan's best interest, their confidence in controlling the family narrative was beginning to waver. This realization gave me both courage and caution. I needed to act decisively, but I also needed to prepare for resistance, threats of emotional manipulation, and attempts to discredit my claims. Internal conflict gnawed at me constantly. I had always been the quiet one, the daughter who avoided confrontation and sought harmony at the expense of my own needs. Yet now, I was faced with a choice: continue to suffer silently and accept the unfair distribution of my inheritance, or step forward and risk family discord to assert what was rightfully mine. I spent nights lying awake, replaying conversations with my parents in my mind, imagining their reactions and debating the ethics of my next moves. Was I being too forceful? Could I strike a balance between justice and reconciliation? Every scenario seemed to carry risks, but one truth remained undeniable: staying silent was no longer an option. As the days progressed, I also began to experience subtle forms of opposition from the outside. Ethan, though silent, became a subtle adversary in the form of passive resistance. Small comments about responsibility, half-hearted questions about my involvement in the estate, and a guarded tone that suggested he suspected more than he let on. It was a strange mixture of kinship and rivalry, and it forced me to remain vigilant. Every interaction had to be carefully measured. I realized that this process wasn't just about the tangible inheritance. It was about proving my discernment, patience, and ability to navigate the tangled loyalties of a family that had underestimated me for years. I turned my attention to compiling all evidence in an organized and indisputable format. With Rachel's help, I cataloged every document, photograph, note, and ledger, creating a comprehensive record that would be difficult to dispute. I even made digital backups, secured with encryption, in case physical copies were tampered with. This process, while painstaking, also became a form of empowerment. For the first time in years, I felt in control of a situation where I had previously been powerless. Grandpa's foresight had given me a tangible advantage, and I was learning to wield it with care, intelligence, and purpose. As I prepared for the eventual confrontation, I began to notice subtle changes in myself. The anger and hurt that had initially driven me began to evolve into determination and clarity. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was the steward of Grandpa's legacy, the custodian of a truth that demanded recognition. And yet, with that clarity came anxiety. Could I confront my parents without destroying the fragile remnants of trust? Could I expose the hidden truth without fracturing my relationship with Ethan? The stakes were higher than ever, and the internal tension grew with each passing day. By the end of the week, I felt a mix of readiness and apprehension. I knew that the time to act was approaching, that the next steps would require courage, precision, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The safe had been discovered, the evidence compiled, and the first seeds of suspicion had taken root. Now it was only a matter of time before the hidden truth would rise to the surface, challenging long-held assumptions, forcing difficult conversations, and demanding that my parents and brother face the consequences of their past decisions. In that moment, I understood that the journey had only begun, and the real test of strength, both emotional and strategic, was yet to come.
The day I decided to take the next step, a sense of nervous anticipation settled over me like a weight I could both feel and hear in the quiet corners of my apartment. I had meticulously organized Grandpa's documents with Rachel, cataloging every ledger, every handwritten note, every deed and bond, and it had become increasingly clear that what lay in that hidden safe wasn't just a sum of money or an assortment of assets. It was a blueprint of my grandfather's foresight, a tangible affirmation of his trust in me, and proof of the injustice perpetrated by my parents. The realization hit me hard. With this evidence in hand, I wasn't just reclaiming an inheritance. I was armed with indisputable truth, a force that could finally expose favoritism and negligence that had gone unchallenged for far too long. I arranged to meet Rachel in the small conference room of her law office, a space bathed in soft fluorescent light and lined with books that smelled faintly of leather and wisdom. I brought with me the full collection of documents and the small box from the safe, each item carefully labeled and numbered. Rachel greeted me with her usual calm composure, but a flicker of anticipation crossed her eyes as she examined the evidence. "Claire," she said, flipping through a stack of deeds and official letters, "this is beyond thorough. There's no question here. Everything in this collection proves your claim, and, more importantly, shows that your parents acted without proper authority or understanding. This isn't just financial proof, it's a moral one." Hearing her words, a wave of vindication surged through me, leaving me both elated and anxious. The stakes had risen exponentially. The next steps would inevitably involve confrontation, exposure, and an emotional reckoning that I could no longer avoid. Rachel and I spent hours cross-referencing the documents, mapping out a timeline, and noting the legal implications of each asset. The evidence was airtight. Every instruction Grandpa had left, every careful designation of beneficiaries, and every precaution against impulsive distribution to Ethan was clearly recorded. There was even correspondence with trusted financial advisors indicating that the safe's contents were to be revealed only if the primary inheritance distribution failed or if favoritism prevented equitable access. In that moment, it became crystal clear that Grandpa had deliberately ensured that I would not be overlooked. He had anticipated human error, familial bias, and the frailty of judgment, leaving me a way to reclaim my inheritance and my dignity. I left Rachel's office with a mixture of empowerment and apprehension. The reality of what I now held in my hands weighed heavily on me. I had undeniable proof, but the revelation also meant that the balance of power within my family was about to shift. How my parents would react, how Ethan would respond, and how the hidden truth would alter relationships were questions that loomed larger than the tangible value of the inheritance itself. As I drove back to Mapleton, my mind raced with strategies, contingencies, and worst-case scenarios. I knew that the undeniable proof had the potential to change everything, but it also had the potential to unravel the delicate web of familial relationships I still hoped to preserve. Once home, I laid out the documents on my dining table, feeling an almost sacred weight in their presence. I couldn't help but remember Grandpa's voice, his quiet assurance that life required both patience and discernment. He had taught me that truth, when revealed carefully, had the power to command respect and demand justice without unnecessary destruction. I resolved to honor that wisdom. This wasn't a time for impulsive confrontation or emotional outbursts. It was a time for careful planning, deliberate steps, and strategic exposure. I needed to ensure that my parents, and anyone else involved, would recognize the legitimacy of my claim beyond doubt. The days that followed involved careful observation. I watched my parents' routines, their conversations, and subtle reactions when Grandpa's belongings were mentioned. Marlene would sometimes murmur to herself about how thorough Grandpa was, while Richard displayed an unusual hesitancy in discussing the estate, avoiding direct answers and offering vague assurances.
Even Ethan, who had previously been aloof, began asking subtle questions about Grandpa's old study, documents, and financial instructions. The undeniable proof I now possessed loomed over all of us like an invisible pressure. Its presence felt even before words were spoken. I realized that the truth was no longer contained within the safe. It had begun to assert itself, reshaping dynamics, raising suspicion, and demanding attention. Finally, I scheduled a meeting with Rachel to formally review the evidence one last time before approaching my parents. Together, we went through each document, each instruction, and each stipulation, ensuring that nothing could be misinterpreted or dismissed. Rachel's calm, methodical approach bolstered my confidence. "Claire," she said, "when you present this, there will be no argument. The proof is undeniable. You've done everything right, and your grandfather's intentions couldn't be clearer. This isn't just financial proof, it's a moral one." Hearing her words, a wave of vindication surged through me, leaving me both elated and anxious. The stakes had risen exponentially. The next steps would inevitably involve confrontation, exposure, and an emotional reckoning that I could no longer avoid.
That night, I sat alone at my dining table. The evidence spread before me like a tangible roadmap of truth. I felt a mix of nervous excitement and solemn responsibility. The midpoint of my journey had arrived. The undeniable proof of Grandpa's intentions, the hidden inheritance, and the oversight of my parents now rested entirely in my hands. I understood that the coming days would test my resolve, my moral compass, and my ability to navigate confrontation with intelligence and grace. Grandpa had left me the tools to reclaim what was mine, but it was up to me to wield them wisely, ensuring that justice, not vengeance, guided my next steps. In that moment, I felt a profound connection to him, as if he were quietly whispering, reminding me that truth, once revealed, held the power to change everything. The moment of decision came quietly in the stillness of my apartment late one night. I had spent hours reviewing Grandpa's documents, double-checking every ledger, bond, and instruction to ensure that nothing could be misinterpreted. The undeniable proof was in my hands, and with it, a choice that would change the course of my life. Continue living in quiet resentment, pretending the inheritance loss didn't matter, or confront my parents and demand recognition for the truth that had been hidden from them. My mind raced, weighing consequences and outcomes. I thought of Grandpa and the deliberate foresight that had guided him to protect me, and for the first time, a sense of clarity settled over my fears. This was not just about money. It was about integrity, justice, and reclaiming my place within a family that had dismissed me for far too long. I called Ethan the next morning, inviting him to meet me at a small, quiet cafe where no one from the family would see us. The familiar hum of espresso machines and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee offered a strangely comforting backdrop as I laid out the situation for him. I explained that I had discovered Grandpa's hidden safe, detailed its contents, and described the thorough documentation that proved the assets were intended for me, not as a supplement to the inheritance already given to him. Ethan's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and an almost imperceptible fear crossing his face. "Claire, are you serious?" he asked, voice low, glancing around as if expecting someone to overhear. I nodded, careful to maintain my composure. "I have proof," I said, placing the neatly organized documents on the table. "Everything Grandpa left, everything he intended, it's all here. This isn't about revenge. It's about honoring his wishes and correcting the oversight." Watching Ethan process the revelation was fascinating and nerve-wracking at the same time. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, clearly torn between loyalty to our parents and recognition of the truth before him. I could see the gears turning in his mind. The ethical dilemma, the pressure of family expectations, and the undeniable logic of the documents before him. Finally he spoke, his voice hesitant but earnest. I had no idea Grandpa planned this for you. I mean, I knew he cared about both of us, but
His words faltered, and I filled the pause with a quiet determination. This is his plan, Ethan, not Mom's or Dad's. He trusted me to find it, and now we have a responsibility to see it through as he intended. He nodded slowly, the initial resistance fading, replaced by an understanding that what Grandpa had left me was not only legally binding, but morally indisputable. After Ethan's reluctant but important acknowledgement, I turned my attention to my parents. I knew that confronting them directly would be difficult, but the undeniable proof left me little choice. That evening, I arranged a family meeting under the guise of discussing Grandpa's belongings. Marlene greeted me warmly, though her smile faltered when she noticed the folders and box I carried. Richard's face was stoic, though I caught a flicker of tension in his eyes as I placed the documents on the table. I began calmly, laying out the facts without accusation, carefully presenting the evidence from Grandpa's safe. The room felt thick with silence. Every creak of the old wooden floor amplified in the tension between us. As I revealed the contents and the meticulous instructions Grandpa had left, I could see my parents' carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. Marlene's hand trembled slightly as she reached for a folder, while Richard leaned forward, scanning the documents with furrowed brows. The realization that they had overlooked the existence of the safe and ignored Grandpa's clear instructions hit them visibly. "Claire, we didn't know," Marlene said, voice wavering. I remained calm, though inside my heart raced. "You didn't know because you weren't paying attention. Grandpa trusted me to find this and follow his wishes, and now it's clear what he intended. It's not about taking from Ethan. It's about honoring Grandpa's plan." The room felt charged, emotions raw and palpable. My parents shifted uncomfortably, their defensiveness thinly veiled, and I could sense the internal struggle between pride, embarrassment, and recognition of the undeniable truth. Ethan sat quietly beside me, a supportive presence that helped steady my own nerves. I watched as my parents flipped through the documents, the shock and dawning realization etched across their faces. Finally, Richard looked up, his voice heavy with reluctant acknowledgement. "Claire, it seems you were right. Grandpa did intend this. I can see that now." The weight of those words, simple as they were, carried a vindication that I had longed for. For the first time, I felt the sense of empowerment I had been seeking, not just because of the inheritance, but because I had spoken the truth, stood my ground, and demanded recognition in the face of years of neglect. The choice to speak had been terrifying, but it was necessary. I realized that confrontation was not about creating division, but about clarifying reality, restoring fairness, and honoring Grandpa's intentions. My parents' reactions, though initially defensive, gradually softened as they accepted the irrefutable evidence, and even Ethan's tentative support underscored the importance of truth over favoritism. That night, after the meeting, I sat alone in my room, reflecting on the choice I had made. The fear, the anxiety, and the self-doubt had been intense, but the act of speaking, presenting the truth, and standing firm in my convictions left me with a sense of relief and quiet triumph. Grandpa's foresight, my perseverance, and my courage had converged to create this moment of reckoning. I understood now that speaking the truth, even when difficult and uncomfortable, held power far greater than silence. It commanded recognition, inspired respect, and set the stage for justice to prevail. The path ahead would still be challenging, but having made the choice to act, I felt ready to face whatever consequences or resistance might come next, knowing that integrity had guided my steps. The confrontation with my parents was far from over. Even though I had presented the undeniable proof and Ethan had begun to understand the situation, the undercurrent of tension in our home grew stronger each day. Marlene's quiet apologies and Richard's reluctant nods masked a simmering frustration, as if acknowledging the truth was one thing, but accepting its consequences was something entirely different. They had invested years in believing that Ethan would inherit everything, and now the very foundations of their assumptions had been dismantled. it was clear that the real challenge wasn't merely showing them the evidence, it was navigating the emotional fallout, the resentment, and the subtle attempts to undermine my position. I sensed that both were struggling internally, and their pride, deeply rooted in habit and expectation, was starting to push back against the truth. It started subtly. Marlene began questioning the accuracy of certain documents, pointing out minor inconsistencies that she assumed might invalidate my claim. "Are we sure these ledgers are legitimate?" she asked during one 10th dinner, her tone carefully measured, trying to sound concerned rather than accusatory. Richard, too, began raising objections, claiming that Grandpa had never explicitly handed over instructions to me personally, that perhaps there was room for interpretation, and that the safe's contents could be contested. The calm, rational presentation I had relied on suddenly became a battleground. I felt a pang of frustration, realizing that even undeniable proof could not immediately erase years of bias, pride, and preconceived notions. My parents' resistance was subtle, but deliberate, a test of my resolve and patience. Ethan became an unexpected ally, quietly supporting my perspective while also acting as a mediator between me and our parents. During one particularly heated discussion in the living room, he gently placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice steady. "Mom, Dad, the evidence is clear," he said. "Grandpa planned this for Claire, not because he loved me any less, but because he wanted to protect her from being overlooked. We can't ignore what's right in front of us." His words carried weight, but even then, Marlene and Richard's defensiveness flared and the room filled with tension. Threats, though subtle, began to emerge in the form of emotional appeals and guilt, reminders of past sacrifices, suggestions that I was being unfair, and insinuations that my persistence was divisive. I realized that truth alone didn't immediately dissolve long-held misconceptions. It required strategy, emotional intelligence, and unwavering confidence in the validity of the evidence. The mounting pressure began to take a toll on me, both emotionally and physically. Each interaction with my parents felt like a negotiation in a high-stakes arena where missteps could be exploited and patience was constantly tested. There were nights when I lay awake, exhausted from navigating this delicate balance, questioning whether I had overstepped, whether confrontation had been the right approach, or whether I should have waited for a more opportune moment. But each time I reminded myself of Grandpa's meticulous planning and foresight, the undeniable proof I held, and the principle that standing up for what is right often comes with discomfort and resistance. I understood that pressure in this case was both a test and a confirmation. The more they pushed back, the more necessary it became to remain steadfast. At the same time, I began to notice subtle manipulations from my parents, attempts to redirect conversations or minimize my involvement. They would comment on minor details, question my interpretation of Grandpa's notes, or attempt to bring up past grievances to muddy the waters. It was frustrating, yet also illuminating. I realized that their resistance wasn't malicious in intent, it was rooted in fear, pride, and a desperate need to maintain control over what they had assumed was a straightforward inheritance. This understanding gave me a clearer perspective. The challenge wasn't just legal or procedural. It was about navigating human psychology, negotiating emotions, and asserting the undeniable truth with calm, unwavering authority. Rachel remained a critical anchor throughout this period, advising me on how to respond to objections, how to maintain composure, and how to keep the conversation focused on evidence rather than emotion. She encouraged me to document every interaction, anticipate potential counterarguments, and prepare for subtle tactics designed to test my resolve. Following her guidance, I began keeping a private journal of each conversation, noting objections raised, emotional cues, and strategies used by my parents. This process, though exhausting, strengthened my confidence. I was no longer simply reacting, I was anticipating, planning, and asserting control over the situation, guided by the undeniable proof of Grandpa's foresight. By the second week of mounting tension, it became clear that my parents were beginning to realize that resistance was futile. The sheer weight of documentation, coupled with Ethan's quiet support and my unwavering commitment, was gradually eroding their defenses. There were still moments of subtle opposition, small digs, and emotional appeals, but the foundation of their resistance had begun to crack. The undeniable truth, paired with strategic presentation and calm persistence, was creating a turning point in the household. I felt a quiet sense of vindication, yet I knew this was only the prelude to the more formal confrontation that would finally solidify Grandpa's intentions and my rightful claim. Even as the tension escalated, I noticed a transformation within myself. The pressure, rather than breaking me, was sharpening my focus, reinforcing my commitment to integrity, and teaching me the value of resilience. I realized that truth, while powerful, often meets resistance before acceptance. The mounting pressure from my parents was not a sign of failure, but a necessary step in the process of exposing injustice and asserting rightful ownership. With every tense discussion, every defensive remark, and every subtle challenge, I was learning to navigate opposition with patience, clarity, and unwavering adherence to evidence. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, where the undeniable proof would finally compel acknowledgement and the hidden truth would no longer be contested. Despite the progress I had made in presenting Grandpa's hidden inheritance, the consequences of speaking the truth hit harder than I had anticipated, and it came crashing down in waves I wasn't fully prepared for. The morning after the latest heated discussion with my parents, I awoke to an almost tangible tension in the house, as if every corner had absorbed the echoes of anger and resentment from the night before. Marlene avoided my gaze entirely, her usual warmth replaced with icy formality, while Richard retreated into the familiar stoicism that I now recognized as both a shield and a silent form of protest. Even Ethan, though supportive, had begun to appear cautious, as if he feared that any misstep could reignite a confrontation he wasn't ready to face. The backlash was immediate, unrelenting, and emotionally draining, and it forced me to confront the reality that exposing a long-hidden truth came with consequences I hadn't fully foreseen. It began with subtle, almost passive-aggressive behavior from my parents. Marlene started making sharp comments about my involvement in household matters, questioning decisions I had previously taken for granted, and framing them as unnecessary interference. "Claire, are you sure you need to handle this?" she asked one afternoon, her tone deceptively casual but laced with resentment. Richard, too, began scrutinizing everything I did, from the way I organized Grandpa's documents to how I approached Ethan about the estate. Every action was now interpreted as an assertion of power rather than a continuation of Grandpa's plan, and their resistance manifested not through direct confrontation, but through a cold, persistent pushback that slowly eroded my patience. It became clear that speaking the truth, while morally correct, had opened a door to a backlash rooted in pride, fear, and a deep unwillingness to admit past errors. The emotional toll was compounded by the social implications of the situation. Family, friends, and distant relatives, once neutral parties, began to weigh in subtly, some siding with my parents, while others expressed quiet curiosity about the unfolding tension. Invitations to gatherings were reduced, offhand remarks were loaded with veiled criticism, and I sensed that my presence was being scrutinized in ways I hadn't anticipated. The isolation, though not complete, was palpable. It became a test of endurance, forcing me to rely not only on the evidence I held, but on the inner resolve that had been cultivated through months of preparation and careful planning. I realized that truth, while powerful, often meets resistance before acceptance. The mounting pressure from my parents was not a sign of failure, but a necessary step in the process of exposing injustice and asserting rightful ownership. With every tense discussion, every defensive remark, and every subtle challenge, I was learning to navigate opposition with patience, clarity, and unwavering adherence to evidence.
One afternoon, the backlash intensified when Marlene directly confronted me about a misinterpreted document. She accused me of manipulating Grandpa's instructions, suggesting that I had taken liberties with his intentions to bolster my position. Richard remained silent, but his gaze was sharp, scrutinizing every word I spoke. For a moment, I felt the full sting of the situation, the emotional isolation, the familial resistance, and the fear that my actions could be misrepresented despite overwhelming evidence. I sat quietly, taking a deep breath, reminding myself that Grandpa had anticipated opposition, had safeguarded the proof meticulously, and had left clear instructions that could withstand any argument. This wasn't about ego or revenge, it was about integrity, truth, and honoring Grandpa's foresight. The evenings became particularly difficult, filled with a heavy, oppressive tension that left me emotionally drained. Simple interactions felt like negotiations, each conversation measured against the potential fallout. I struggled with self-doubt, questioning whether I had underestimated the emotional consequences of revealing the hidden inheritance. Every glance from Marlene, every half-word from Richard, and every subtle hesitation from Ether became magnified, feeding into a sense of uncertainty that threatened to overshadow the certainty of the evidence itself. I realized that the journey toward vindication was not linear. It came with setbacks, emotional turbulence, and moments of profound isolation that tested both character and resilience. But even in the darkest moments, I found small reminders of purpose. A note from Grandpa tucked into one of the ledgers, Rachel's quiet reassurance, and Ethan's subtle gestures of support reminded me why I had embarked on this path. I began to see the backlash not as a failure, but as a necessary phase in the process of asserting truth. It was a crucible, designed to challenge resolve, patience, and moral clarity, forcing me to confront not only my parents' resistance, but also my own fears and uncertainties. By facing the emotional consequences head-on, I began to recognize a growing strength within myself, a quiet but unshakable confidence that, despite the turmoil, I was acting in alignment with Grandpa's intentions and with my own principles. By the end of that week, the dark night of the soul reached its peak. I sat alone in Grandpa's study, the soft lamplight illuminating the documents that had become both my burden and my weapon. The house was quiet, yet heavy with the residual tension of unspoken words and simmering resentment. I understood fully that the path to justice and vindication would not be easy, and that the consequences of truth-telling were complex and emotionally taxing. But I also realized that surrendering to fear or hesitation was not an option. Grandpa's foresight, the evidence in my hands, and the moral imperative of standing for what was right demanded perseverance. In that silence, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would endure. I would remain steadfast, and I would see this journey through to the moment where the hidden truth was fully recognized and justice finally prevailed. The day I decided to bring everything into the open felt like stepping onto a stage, the weight of months of preparation pressing on my shoulders. I'd spent countless hours organizing Grandpa's instructions, cataloging every bond, deed, and note from the hidden safe, and mentally rehearsing the presentation I would give to my parents. The final push wasn't just about exposing the truth, it was about creating an environment where evidence, not emotion or manipulation, could dictate the outcome. I knew the confrontation would be tense, that old resentments and pride would flare, and that the stakes extended far beyond financial assets. This was about vindication, integrity, and the legacy Grandpa had entrusted to me. My heart pounded as I carried the box and folders into the living room, where Marlene and Richard were waiting, tension coiled in their posture, and Ethan sat quietly beside me, offering silent reassurance. I began calmly, laying out the evidence in a methodical, deliberate fashion. Every document was placed in order, every ledger explained, every note highlighted. Grandpa's handwriting, meticulous and clear, guided the narrative of his intentions, the careful allocation of assets, the hidden precautions against favoritism, and the explicit instructions that his granddaughter, me, was to inherit what had been inadvertently overlooked. I could feel my parents' eyes narrowing, scanning the papers, absorbing the undeniable truth in silence. Marlene's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Richard's jaw clenched as he studied the ledgers. Ethan's presence beside me was grounding. He didn't speak, but I could feel his quiet support, an unspoken acknowledgement that the moment of reckoning had arrived.
The atmosphere in the room thickened as the reality of the situation began to settle over my parents. I could see Marlene's eyes glisten, a mixture of shame, regret, and dawning understanding. Richard, typically reserved and stoic, exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just enough to betray the tension he had been carrying. Ethan, sensing the shift, reached over and gently placed a hand on my shoulder, giving a subtle nod of encouragement. The undeniable proof had begun to break through layers of pride and resistance, forcing acknowledgement of what had long been hidden. I spoke with calm authority, repeating key points and referencing Grandpa's precise instructions, ensuring that there was no room for misinterpretation or doubt. As I continued, I emphasized the moral and familial implications of the evidence. Grandpa's foresight wasn't just about finances. It was about fairness, responsibility, and the careful consideration of all family members. He anticipated challenges, disagreements, and oversight, I said, looking each of my parents in the eye. This isn't a matter of favoritism. It's a matter of honoring the principles he valued most: integrity, planning, and love for all of us. The proof is here, and it's time to respect his wishes. There was a pause. A quiet moment in which the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway felt amplified, as if marking the moment of truth. Slowly, Marlene spoke, her voice trembling but sincere. "Claire, I see it now. We overlooked this. We should have noticed. Grandpa planned this, and we didn't follow through." Her words carried a weight of acknowledgement that felt like the first step toward reconciliation. Richard, after a long silence, added, "I can't argue with this. The proof is clear. Grandpa's intentions were meticulous, and he trusted you with this responsibility." In that moment, the tension in the room began to lift, replaced by a sense of recognition and, surprisingly, relief. The undeniable truth had prevailed over resistance, and for the first time in months, I felt that my voice and Grandpa's intentions were finally being heard. With the formal confrontation resolved, I moved to address Ethan directly. "I'm glad you understood this from the beginning," I said, smiling faintly. "It's not about taking from you, it's about following Grandpa's plan. I couldn't have done this without your support." He returned the smile, a mixture of relief and newfound respect evident in his expression. The confrontation had served not only to vindicate me, but also to strengthen our sibling relationship, built now on mutual understanding and shared acknowledgement of Grandpa's wisdom. As the meeting concluded, I felt a profound sense of closure. The truth, once hidden and contested, had been fully exposed and recognized. My parents, though initially resistant, had been compelled to acknowledge the evidence, and the legacy Grandpa had entrusted to me was secure. The final push had required courage, precision, and unwavering adherence to principle, but the outcome validated every hour of preparation, every moment of anxiety, and every instance of self-doubt. Grandpa's foresight had guided me, and by standing firm, I had ensured that his wishes would finally be honored. In that room, amid the evidence and the acknowledgement of truth, I experienced a clarity and empowerment that made every challenge of the past months worthwhile. In the days following the confrontation, a subtle shift settled over our household. Almost imperceptible at first, but undeniable once you noticed the absence of tension in the air. The weight of misunderstanding, favoritism, and overlooked intentions had lifted, replaced with a sense of fairness and recognition that had long been missing. My parents moved with quieter footsteps, their eyes no longer searching for faults or inconsistencies in my actions, but instead reflecting contemplation and a tentative respect. The acknowledgement of Grandpa's instructions, the hidden safe, and the deliberate planning behind it had begun to redefine our family dynamic. Where there had been frustration and resistance, there was now space for reconciliation and understanding. The inheritance was no longer just a sum of money or a collection of bonds. It was a symbol of integrity, foresight, and the value of speaking truth in the face of doubt. Rachel's advice had been invaluable in this stage. guiding me on how to navigate the delicate transition from confrontation to resolution. She emphasized that legal clarity and moral authority were both crucial, but emotional intelligence and patience would cement the changes. Following her counsel, I approached each interaction with my parents carefully, reinforcing that this was not about division, but about honoring Grandpa's legacy. Marlene, who had initially struggled to accept the proof without defensiveness, began to open up in small ways, asking about the documentation, sharing memories of Grandpa, and even expressing regret for the oversight that had fueled months of tension. Richard, usually reserved and stoic, began participating in these conversations. His acknowledgement of the truth carried weight that validated my position further. It became clear that the acknowledgement of evidence and the careful, principled manner in which I had presented it had a profound impact on not only the outcome, but on the emotional healing within our family.
Ethan, too, took on a new role in this resolution phase, not just as a supportive sibling, but as an advocate for fairness within the family. He began encouraging open dialogue, ensuring that our parents had the opportunity to express their thoughts and emotions while reinforcing the legitimacy of the proof I had uncovered. His presence was stabilizing, and I realized how critical it was to have allies who understood the nuances of both emotional and practical consequences. The inheritance, once a source of tension and conflict, became a catalyst for transparency and a deeper appreciation for Grandpa's careful planning. The house, once heavy with the residue of unspoken grievances, began to feel lighter, more intentional, and more connected. One evening, as we gathered in the living room to review the final arrangements for the estate, I felt a profound sense of closure. The documents had been organized, the instructions fully acknowledged, and all parties were beginning to operate with a clear understanding of responsibilities and entitlements. Marlene admitted with quiet humility that she had underestimated Grandpa's foresight, and Richard, while reserved, expressed a newfound respect for the diligence and care that had gone into securing the hidden inheritance. Ethan and I, sitting side by side, shared a quiet satisfaction. The journey had been long, fraught with emotional challenges, subtle resistance, and intense pressure, but the resolution was now within reach. Justice had been served, not through confrontation alone, but through careful adherence to principle, moral clarity, and the undeniable proof that Grandpa had left behind. The process of resolution also allowed me to reflect on my own transformation throughout this journey. I had entered this process as someone uncertain, hesitant, and cautious, unsure of how to assert myself within the family or navigate the complex emotional landscape that accompanied hidden truths. Through months of preparation, confrontation, and perseverance, I had grown into someone capable of standing firm in the face of resistance, articulating truth with calm authority, and navigating delicate familial relationships with empathy and intelligence. The inheritance, while significant, had become secondary to the personal growth and self-assurance I had cultivated along the way. Grandpa's foresight had not only ensured my rightful claim, but it also guided me toward the development of courage, discernment, and resilience. With the estate formally organized and responsibilities clarified, a sense of equilibrium began to take hold. The house, once filled with tension and unspoken accusations, now felt like a space where fairness and mutual respect could coexist with the shared memories of our grandfather. Conversations, once charged with defensiveness, became calm and reflective, often centered on Grandpa's life, lessons, and the careful planning he had undertaken to protect all of us. Even Ethan, who at times had struggled with the emotional complexity of the situation, expressed gratitude for the clarity that had emerged and the strengthened bond between us as siblings. In that period, I realized that justice and vindication were not merely about correcting a financial oversight. They were about creating a new standard of honesty, transparency, and recognition within the family. By the end of the week, a true sense of resolution had been established. The inheritance had been rightfully acknowledged, Grandpa's instructions fully honored, and the family dynamic had shifted toward balance, fairness, and understanding. The journey, which had begun with uncertainty, hidden truths, and mounting opposition,
culminated in an outcome that preserved both justice and relationships. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not only for reclaiming what was mine, but for facilitating a process that allowed my parents to recognize their oversight, acknowledge Grandpa's intentions, and adjust their perspectives with dignity. The equilibrium we had achieved was more than legal or financial, it was emotional, moral, and deeply human. Sitting in the living room that evening, watching my parents and Ethan discuss plans for the estate with newfound clarity, I finally allowed myself to breathe fully. The tension that had hung over the household for months had dissipated, replaced by a steady rhythm of respect, understanding, and shared responsibility. My parents, now fully aware of the foresight Grandpa had employed, approached both the estate and our relationships with a newfound humility. Conversations no longer carried the edge of defensiveness or veiled accusation, but rather a willingness to listen, reflect, and honor what was right. Ethan and I, once divided by the misperceptions surrounding the inheritance, had become closer than ever, bound not only by blood, but by the shared experience of navigating a complex emotional journey toward truth and fairness.
For me personally, the transformation was profound. I realized that uncovering Grandpa's hidden safe had been about much more than money or material assets. It had been a crucible through which I discovered the depths of my own courage, perseverance, and moral clarity. Where once I had hesitated, second-guessed myself, and feared confrontation, I now understood the strength that comes from standing firm in the face of resistance and injustice. I had learned to balance patience with assertiveness, empathy with principle, and strategy with integrity. The inheritance had been a catalyst, but the true reward was the confidence, self-respect, and clarity I had gained. Grandpa's foresight had not only secured what was rightfully mine, but it had also guided me toward becoming the person capable of honoring it fully. The hidden safe itself became a symbol of this transformation. Its contents, meticulously organized and preserved, reminded me daily of the importance of careful planning, attention to detail, and the courage to act when the time comes. I found myself returning to the study where Grandpa had kept his treasures, not out of necessity, but as a quiet ritual of reflection. Each document, ledger, and note represented more than financial value. They embodied wisdom, foresight, and trust. The trust that Grandpa had placed in me to follow through, even when the path was fraught with challenges. The safe had been a physical manifestation of his belief in fairness and integrity, and by honoring his wishes, I had internalized those same principles within myself. With the inheritance settled and the family dynamic restored, I began to consider how I could use this experience to help others facing similar situations. I shared my story carefully with close friends and mentors, emphasizing the lessons learned, the power of persistence, the importance of evidence, and the necessity of standing for truth even when it feels uncomfortable or isolating. I also took steps to organize the documents and records in a way that could serve as a model for other families, highlighting best practices for transparency, foresight, and safeguarding assets against oversight or favoritism. The inheritance, once a source of tension and conflict, had now become a tool for education, empowerment, and inspiration for those navigating complex familial and legal challenges. Ethan and I began planning small initiatives together, including workshops and informal discussions about inheritance planning, family communication, and ethical decision-making. His involvement reinforced the idea that cooperation and transparency are essential, even among those who might initially be on opposing sides of a conflict. By sharing our story, we hope to provide both practical guidance and moral encouragement, showing that courage, preparation, and persistence can lead to outcomes that honor truth and fairness. Grandpa's lessons, though delivered in the form of hidden documents and carefully planned safeguards, had extended beyond our family, becoming a living legacy that could impact others in meaningful ways. On a personal level, I embraced a newfound sense of empowerment and purpose. I felt confident in my ability to navigate future challenges, both familial and professional, with a balance of principle, strategy, and compassion. The experience had taught me that speaking the truth, even when difficult or uncomfortable, is a necessary and transformative act. I also recognize the importance of patience, emotional intelligence, and careful planning in achieving justice and resolution. Every interaction, every obstacle, and every moment of resistance had contributed to a deep, enduring sense of self-assurance and clarity. I knew that moving forward, I would approach challenges with a calm determination and a steadfast commitment to integrity. Perhaps most importantly, the journey had changed the way I viewed family, legacy, and responsibility.
Sitting in Grandpa's study one quiet evening, reflecting on the months that had passed, I felt a profound sense of closure and fulfillment. The documents, the ledgers, and the hidden safe had served their purpose, guiding me toward action, teaching patience, and reinforcing the value of standing for what is right. I had faced resistance, isolation, and self-doubt, but through perseverance, careful strategy, and moral clarity, I had achieved resolution, vindication, and personal transformation. Grandpa's legacy was secure, our family bonds were stronger, and I had emerged from the experience wiser, more confident, and determined to use my insight and experience to help others navigate their own challenges. In that moment, I understood fully the power of truth, the value of integrity, and the enduring impact of courage. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.